welcome to Gray Matter. Today, I have a wonderful guest who I think everyone is going to really be interested to hear from. Renowned scientist, Dr. J. Bhattacharya, MD, PhD in economics, professor at Stanford University, author of more than 155 peer-reviewed scientific articles in economics and epidemiology, and famously one of the three architects of what has become known as the Great Barrington Declaration. So what are we doing today? What is the goal? This podcast is aimed at debating, discussing, and illuminating important topics of both particular and broad interest in law, science, philosophy, history, religion, economics, sports, and politics. We're not going to endeavor to cover all of those today, but I expect we're going to touch on parts of them because the guest that we have is fully able to do so. We assume that everyone tuned in is intelligent and that they're therefore hungry to engage in a deep discussion of not only the issues of our time, but also for all time. The goal is to provide a forum for long-form discussion of issues that both dominate and guide public discourse. This will be achieved by hosting guests whose ideas will invite others to engage in a journey of discovery and personal growth. Each episode is framed by an aphorism, a quotation that will provide the entry point for the topic to be discussed. Today, we look to the man whom Albert Einstein once called the smartest man who ever lived, the alchemist, Sir Isaac Newton. Each episode will end with a reading recommendation to the audience to enhance their understanding of the topic examined, and I've asked Dr. J to give us one at the close of the show. So today's show is entitled "Standing on the Shoulders of Giants," and here I'm borrowing from a famous quotation from Sir Isaac Newton. Those of you who don't know about Sir Isaac Newton, he basically defined or discovered, if you can call it that, all the basic laws of motion. One of which is gravity. It's what's tying me to this chair. And he famously said that, "To me, there has never been a higher source of earthly honor or distinction than that connected with advances in science." He also famously wrote that if I have seen further than others, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants. He also said, "I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." So why are we talking about science today? Well, we have a scientist on the show, and I want to take a different approach to science. So much of what we hear today in the public discourse is really an attack upon science. It's almost a defamation of science. So today, what I want to do is I want to celebrate science. I want to look to the history of science. And I want to talk to a renowned scientist about what he thinks is going on in not only within the scientific world, but how what is going on there is affecting broader society in terms of what is being communicated to us. Many people today are fearful of science. They view it as almost superstition or mysticism. Consider only what has been told us about COVID-19. And of course, Dr. J is a renowned expert on that. So to start with, I'd like to introduce our guest. Good afternoon, Doctor. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
I'm sure that you're very familiar to a lot of the people who are tuning in. I expect they are. What I'd like to do, if you don't mind, I know from getting to know you, I think somewhat well recently. You were kind enough to describe us as kindred spirits, which is another way of calling us nerds, I think. But I know you have a very inspiring and fascinating personal history, and I was hoping you'd share a little bit of that with the people who are listening in. Could you take us through a little bit of your personal biography, beginning with your family background and how you came to live in California and so on?
Sure, although I don't know how fascinating it is. It's so my dad, before I was born, he was Indian, and he got to study in the United States for his PhD. He came back to India, applied for the least visa lottery to go to the U.S., married my mom, had us. won the visa lottery like in the early 70s. Came to the U.S. Actually, he couldn't find a job. He was an engineer, a rocket scientist engineer, and he couldn't find a job. So he worked for McDonald's for a couple of years because it was like a middle of a recession. After that, after he found a job, we came. So I've been in the U.S. since I was like 4 or 5 years old, and I've been at Stanford since I was 18. I was an undergraduate here at Stanford. This is where I'm recording. I studied. I always wanted to be a doctor, but I discovered that the economics while I was an undergraduate just fascinated me. This idea that you could use math and statistics. So I did both. I pursued both medicine and economics. What I found is that the methods of economics actually apply really well in answering important questions in medicine. I mean, in economics, the difficulty is often you can't tell what causes. Like when you have a correlation, you don't necessarily know that the correlation implies causation. Right? You can have two things that are very strongly correlated with each other, but they could be a third cause underneath it. There could be spurious reasons why they're correlated. And economics is really good at trying to understand when you have observational data how to tease that apart. Turns out it applies in spades in medicine. And also in medicine, there's these issues about like costs and benefits, every single thing you do, right? So you give a medicine, and what happens is you have to understand that there's going to be side effects in some set of patients. How do you balance that? So you have to make sure the benefits from the medicine you give it better or offset the harms. Well, economics, that's what it's about, right? Harms and benefits. So I pursued both, and I've been at Stanford as a professor for about 20 some years, focusing on my research on a wide variety of topics within medicine, all within this framework of thinking through what the trade-offs are, with a goal toward improving the health of populations. And for most of that time, I've worked on and published on infectious disease epidemiology, and the trade-offs there, because it seemed like such a fascinating topic and important to human health.
I've heard you say that you love America, which is to say you love freedom. I heard something of a charming story about you and the first chocolate bar you ever had. Would you mind telling that story if it's not too embarrassing?
Sure. When I landed in the U.S., I think it was 4 or 5. I forget exactly how old I was. My dad met me and my mom and my brother, none of whom had ever flown before. Back then, it was this long trip where you go it was like Calcutta to Delhi, Delhi to Frankfurt, Frankfurt to London, London to New York. I don't know how my mom dealt with us. Apparently, my brother ran away at one of the airports. When we finally landed, my dad and my uncle met us, handed me a Hershey's chocolate bar. And I thought to myself, this is a great country.
That's wonderful.
One of my earliest memories. And
I understand that your siblings also are all very educated and successful people in their own right.
Yeah, my brother he actually got his PhD in electrical engineering, actually like my dad did, and he now works he's a CEO of a company that works in the architecture industry.
So, what was it that led you into academia? You've mentioned that you always wanted to be a doctor, but was it always your goal to also be a teacher and to write and to publish scientific articles and studies?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't, when I first entered medicine, I didn't know that I wanted to get a PhD. But I had the sense I always wanted to be an academic. I mean, I love working in areas where I don't know the answer. I love working in areas where the data, I can explore data and understand new things about what I'm studying. And frankly, I like learning. I love the process of struggling with a difficult thing, you don't always like figure it out, but that process is I find is really fun, and talking with and arguing with other scientists about this, looking for experiments that would shed light on something important. I mean, I've always found that fascinating, fun, and that's how I felt about my career. It's been filled with that.
So I suppose another way of putting that is that you're a truth seeker.
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, it's it's not it's sometimes it's frustrating because you can't figure out a problem and sometimes you spend years on a problem and you don't figure it out. But it is absolutely true. Like I love even if it's not me that's just made the discovery. If I read a paper and it changes my mind about something I used to believe, makes me really happy. When a student challenges me and says, "Jay, you're wrong on this or that," I mean, and they're right. It's great. It's a great moment for me because it's my student doing it, so I get to take partial credit, and then B, because it's a moment where I can see their level of learning, and I personally can learn myself. It's fantastic.
That's very fascinating because it ties in rather well with some of the reading I did about Sir Isaac Newton, in that scientists of his era, and maybe you share this view, but scientists of his era were of the view that really what they were doing is they were revealing the hidden secrets of the natural world. And when he talks about standing upon the shoulders of giants, he's saying two things. Number one, that he's sort of the curator, the beneficiary of all the great scientists who came before. And also that he understood that scientists have this tremendous duty and really privilege of carrying on everything that they've learned onto the next generation. And Newton, I believe, he used the metaphor of laying down threads that could be picked up by future generations of scientists. So it sounds as though you're sort of see yourself within that same type of tradition.
Well, I'm not Isaac Newton. He really is a giant himself. He was actually, frankly, from what I understand, it was a bit of false modesty on his part when he said he was standing on the shoulders of giants, because he viewed himself as a giant as well. But in my case, it's not false. Definitely not Isaac Newton. But I think that I love that vision, though, right? So there's another Isaac Newton quote where he talks about like his career is just him standing at the edge of an ocean picking up pebbles. The world is such a complicated, difficult to understand place, but we have this faith that if we work hard and are open with each other and try to learn from each other, we can learn about it. We can start to understand what the world is truly like. What are the connections, the hidden secrets about the world, the hidden connections of the world underneath it that are available to us if we keep our minds open, if we pay attention to data. That it's not something that's it's not magic. It's something that you can see empirically and evaluate and the scientific process, I think, is so good for that reason, right? It's this process of discovery of these like important facts about the way the world works, but it is a process. It's not just a set of facts about the world that we take as given and that's it. It's not a dead thing. Science is a dialectical process by which truth emerges, I believe, about the physical world, right? So scientists discuss with each other. I have an idea, you have an idea. We may disagree about what the implications are. So we work through the implications of your idea, the implications of mine, run an experiment. Dang it, you're right this time. And then, I take you out to dinner, and then we have another argument about the next idea. I think that kind of dialectical process, goes back to Newton. Goes back, I think, even further than Newton. We're in the middle of this incredible conversation with each other and with scientists that come before and with scientists that are to come.
That kind of conversation that you're talking about, though, implies the existence of something very important, which is under attack, and that's freedom, right? And I'd like to play a clip here. Number 2, Devin, please, about implied coercion.
What it essentially did is it sent a signal to all other people, scientists and others, who were having qualms with this lockdown focused policy, and told them, if it's a nice career you got there, if you're to speak up, with that nice NIH grant you have, well, I don't know, like it would be nasty if something were to happen to it.
So, talking about people like Sir Isaac Newton or Galileo, they had a concern. They had to be careful about running afoul of the Catholic Church, which was the state at the time. But Today, there's a new source of censorship, isn't there, Dr. J? And so scientists now today are not as free as they once were to engage in this important conversation that you called it, this free exchange of ideas that really, let's say, is the strongest steel is forged in hottest fire. We get to the best ideas that benefit not only science but inferentially, really every aspect of our lives is improved by science. Science is so incredibly potent as a mover of people, of things, ideas, civilizations, and this freedom today is really under attack, isn't it?
Yeah, so let me give just a bit of context to listeners about that little clip you just played. I wrote, as you mentioned in the introduction, this document with Sunetra Gupta, she's a fantastic mathematician and epidemiologist at Oxford University, and Martin Kulldorff, professor at Harvard University, a biostatistician, epidemiologist, another fantastic scholar, both better scholars than me, frankly. But so we wrote this document where we argued for focused protection of the vulnerable and lifting of lockdowns as a way to address that epidemic in October of 2020. 4 days later, the head of the National Institute of Health, Francis Collins, the famous scientist himself, wrote an email to Tony Fauci, in which he said that the three of us were fringe epidemiologists, and he called for a devastating published takedown of the premises of the Great Barrington Declaration. Tony Fauci replied with a link to a magazine article criticizing the Great Barrington Declaration. What followed was essentially a year in running of people misconstruing what we just said, and specifically, I believe that misconstrual stemmed from the conversations that people like Francis Collins and Tony Fauci had. They argued that rather than like engaging with us in good faith, they mischaracterized the Great Barrington Declaration as a call to let the virus rip. I mean, and so what happened was it was a very strange thing. Like reporters started calling me, asking me why I want to let the virus rip. A lot of people signed the Great Barrington Declaration, by the way. Tens of thousands of doctors and scientists, hundreds of thousands of regular people signed it. And what started happening was like people that signed it some lost their jobs. Some lost their opportunities to work on grants. Some their colleagues shunned them. They were pushed to the fringe, even though they weren't previously on the fringe. If you think about what actually happened there, you had a high official in the American government who's in control of a large chunk of research funding, tens of billions of dollars, $45 billion, I think, is something on that order a year. So if you don't get grant funding from the NIH as a scientist in medicine, you basically can't do your work. You won't get promoted, right? So I teach at Stanford University. In order to get tenure, which I have, I had to win NIH grants. If I hadn't won NIH grants, it would have been very difficult to get tenure. Now it's possible to get tenure without it, but it's much harder. Tony Fauci and Francis Collins control the success or failure of countless scientists in the United States and elsewhere. So when they write that we're fringe, essentially they're sending a message, and they have their preferred policy, their preferred lockdown policy, right? They're sending a message to every scientist: look, you either line up behind us on our preferred lockdown policy, or we're gonna cast you to the outer edge of this, into the pit of fire, right? I mean, you're not going to have any success as a scientist any longer. That's essentially what he was trying to do there. He's trying to push us past the pale of settlement, if you will, and outside, so that now, and of course, it's they can do this to us, the three of us, but it wasn't really aimed at just the three of us. It was aimed at sending a message to other scientists: stay silent, fall in line, or else.
So what you're really talking about here is something of a coordinated campaign. So we're going to call scientists from places like Stanford and Oxford and Harvard fringe epidemiologists, because that is going to cause a chill on all the other people involved in the scientific community. In other words, going after the leaders. Just to follow up and elucidate what Dr. J was just talking about, Devin, could you please play the coordinated campaign clip, which I think was clip number 3?
Thanks to, this is the American Institute for Economic Research published emails from some of these scientists revealing that they want to discredit you. After the conference, Dr. Francis Collins called 3 of the scientists in attendance, quote, fringe epidemiologists. So your feeling upon learning that there was a coordinated campaign against you?
I kind of sensed, even from the last year, that there was some very strange things happening. Reporters started calling me very shortly after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, asking me why I wanted to let the virus rip through society. The Great Barrington Declaration doesn't say that we want to let the virus rip society. Quite the contrary. We said we wanted to take action to protect the vulnerable. We had a lot of discussion about that. And what I actually hoped out of that was a broader conversation with public health officials who know the living circumstances of the elderly in their communities and are perfectly capable of devising creative ways to protect the vulnerable.
So it's worth mentioning that the Great Barrington Declaration, I think Dr. J, was released, I believe, in September or October of 2020. Is that correct?
Yeah, October 4th, 2020.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's worth mentioning, of course, many people watching this either know or should know that these fringe epidemiologists happen to be right. History proved them right, which I know you well enough to know you don't take any personal vindication in that, but it just happens to be true that all across the world now, countries, many countries and states, provinces in Canada have changed course and have discovered that what was indicated in the Great Barrington Declaration about how lockdown measures or non-pharmaceutical interventions, how they simply don't work and how they cause tremendous harm. But I want to go a bit deeper than that and really examine the question, and this is what I really want to pick your brain about, Doctor, is why are certain scientific ideas and certain thinkers being suppressed and censored? Why has there been this shift away from the type of historical scientific inquiry and conversation that you grew up with that led you into academia, and obviously is your vocation? That's what you see. Your life is one of discovery. So why have we gotten away from that? Why is this happening?
Well, I mean, we can. There's like political reasons we can talk about, I think, but I think they're not as interesting as the intellectual reasons. I think what we saw intellectually during the pandemic was a clash between two norms. There's a norm in science which we've discussed, this Enlightenment norm of free discussion, free exploration of ideas, an openness to being corrected by data or others, and this common sort of common task that we take on as with each other, in collaboration with each other to try to discover complicated things. It's a long conversation, as I said, and it's a conversation that proceeds on the assumptions of good faith of other scientists, and also as well on the idea the idea that you can think about any idea, you can have any hypothesis, and then that hypothesis, as outlandish as it may seem at first, if there's data, if it's logical, and it sort of subsumes other explanations and convinces other scientists, well, that's going to become the preferred one. It doesn't matter how crazy the idea is, right? So there's no bounds on thinking in science, no bounds on communication. There's another norm, though, that's been in play during the pandemic, and that is the norm of public health. Now, public health, while it's closely aligned with science, is not exactly science. It has different goals. It has different techniques. It has different norms, right? So one of the things about public health is clear and simple communication with the public, because one of the goals of public health is to provide good information to the public so that they can make healthy choices in their own lives. And if you have complicated explanations, if you have really sort of difficult a difficult parameter. I mean, it's just you can confuse a lot of people, and that could actually end up harming people. So the norm in public health is clear, simple communication, and the communication needs to be based in scientific, like consensus scientific positions. So what that means is that there's not actually the norm of free discussion within public health. So I'll just give you an example, right? So if I go out in public and say, "Oh no, smoking is good for you," a Stanford professor saying smoking is good for you. Well, I've committed a sin, right? I've done something very, very wrong. I've now told people a false thing because the scientific literature is absolutely convincing. This smoking causes lung cancer, is bad for you. I've committed a violation of a norm in public health as a reasonable one. I shouldn't be doing that. So free discussion in public health is actually very constrained. I shouldn't be going around contradicting public health orders without like a deep look at my conscience. Whereas in science, I absolutely should be saying, no, Leighton, you believe that, but that's not true. Then we fight. That it can be in public. It doesn't matter. That's science. The problem here is that we have the scientific norm on the one side, which says let's discuss freely. On the other hand, you have this very constrictive public health norm where that kind of free exchange is not actually encouraged. But I'll tell you, Leighton, the ethical basis of applying the public health norm is that there is a scientific consensus. It is absolutely unethical to apply the norms of public health in terms of restrictions of free conversation when there has not been a scientific consensus reached. Then it's just population control with no real benefit. And I think that's where we were at the time of the Great Barrington Declaration. And actually, unfortunately, I think that's still where we are, that people are applying this restrictive norm of discussion that has good reasons why it's a norm in public health to a situation where the ethical basis for that norm has not actually been met. There is the scientific consensus has not been reached that lockdown is the right thing to do.
So there's a false consensus that is misleading to the public and also very, very dangerous to public health.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the actions of people like Tony Fauci and Francis Collins, the goal was to create this sense of consent. That's why they called us fringe because, you're these radical ideas. The center says we must do a lockdown. We can, with the implication that if we just lock down hard enough, if you just can obey long enough, the virus will stop. That we'll be able to like reduce the spread of the virus to low enough levels. We never have to worry about it again. You just listen to us, we the gurus. You'll solve this like scary thing that you're focused on. And it's all these like people on the fringe that are stopping it from happening, right? So it's like two-part. One is to create this illusion of consensus, and then the second part is to make sure that anyone who might have heterodox ideas is cast out, so that the public doesn't get confused.
I want to play a clip, Devin, about false consensus, and then I want to come back to you, Doctor, and talk about the cost, the different types of costs of this, what they are to not only academia and science, but to other aspects of society. Could you play that clip, please, Devin?
Okay, you can ignore me, but like you had Martin Kulldorff at Harvard University and Sunetra Gupta at Oxford University signing on, and tens of thousands of others, epidemiologists and scientists signing on, essentially to call all of that opposition fringe. What was at play here? What they wanted to do was to create a false sense that there was a scientific consensus when there wasn't a scientific consensus. They effectively lied and created a propaganda campaign in order to get their policy. And unfortunately, they got their way.
So I suppose we could speculate about why people like Dr. Fauci engaged in this type of campaign. But Doctor, I want to talk more about the costs of this. I know I've heard you say, because you're a public health person and you have a very deep interest in public health, and you feel very deeply that responsibility. I've heard you say that perhaps the most serious cost, societal cost, of the COVID-19 pandemic and the way that it was presented to the public is that it has fundamentally altered the state of trust which previously existed between people like yourselves who are responsible for disseminating accurate public health information and the trust that the public held in that. So that, for example, using the example of something like Ebola, if we get another Ebola, and heaven forbid we got an Ebola that was as contagious as Omicron, let's call it the super virus, at least half the public or more would ignore public health warnings from people like yourselves. I've heard you say that's perhaps the greatest harm that's been done to the whole concept of public health. Would you want to elaborate on that a bit for us?
Sure. I mean, although there's so many candidates for the worst harms, the lockdowns have been devastating to human health in so many ways. The effectiveness of public health relies very fundamentally on the trust of the public, right? So if I don't, as a member of the public, believe that public health has my best interest at heart, why would I listen? And in fact, why would I in fact, I go out of my way not to listen. I'll go out of my way to protest it, to resist it, because I don't believe that you're, on the other hand, if I have, the public health has the trust of the public and ask the public to sacrifice, well, I mean, you'll get very broad-based buy-in. You saw this in the beginning of the pandemic. The public health authorities asked people to do extraordinary things. Stop their lives, essentially, stop sending their kids to school, end their works, close their businesses down. And people complied because they trusted public health. That's the power of public health. Public health, and by the way, I should say, I think public health is incredibly important for the health of the public. If public health performs poorly, you end up with more deaths, more misery, more suffering. So it's very important that public health works and has the trust of the public which is needed for it to work. What's happened during the pandemic is absolutely devastating the trust. First and foremost, the public health authorities have repeatedly engaged in behavior that's brought people to distrust them, even by their own admission, right? So they admitted telling noble lies in order to get the public to comply with orders, like very, very famously with masks at the beginning of the epidemic. Where Tony Fauci admitted that he lied about the inefficacy of masks in order to save them for healthcare workers. Although I think I think he was telling the truth then, but that's another matter. Public health, when it says that it's telling those noble lies. Another one is how high is the mortality rate from getting COVID? People routinely overestimate the hospitalization risk and mortality risk by orders of magnitude. Still to this day, the data from very large number of studies, it's something like the mortality rate before Omicron is something like worldwide was something like 0.2% for an infection. So if you get infected, the probability of dying is 0.2%, or survival is 99.8%. And there's a very steep age gradient, right? Where the oldest people are much higher risk of dying, 3, 4, 5% if you're much older, versus young people who have, and especially children, have a much lower risk of dying, orders of magnitude lower. But the public health effectively told a lie, made this impression that in fact we were all more or less equally at risk, or there really wasn't such a steep gradient, in order to make everyone feel like they needed to pitch in. They told this and over and over they overestimated. They told essentially long before they had any data, and it turned out to be false what they said, but that like cloth masks would protect others. That's not true. Like randomized studies before the pandemic and during the pandemic illustrated that's not true. Over and over again, they've told things that in order to control behavior of people, go far beyond what the science had said. And it effectively undermined the trust of much of the public in public health. The other thing I think they've done to undermine public trust is they've engaged in partisan behavior. I think that's happened more in the U.S. than probably most other places. But I think it's a general phenomenon. So like you had your top medical journals endorsing a presidential candidate during a contentious presidential election. I mean, for the first time in history, right? It's not. I mean, newspapers endorse candidates, not medical journals. You had what does that do? It sends a signal to the people who want to vote for this presidential candidate that they're looked down on, like they're on the outside. Public health has to have the trust of almost everybody. It can't have the trust of only half the population and still be effective. It's not like other institutions in society. It really needs pretty close to unanimous support. And there's this like broad sense that that public health has a partisan bias, right? It's frankly a left-wing partisan bias. And worse, I mean, it's fine to have a left-wing partisan bias, and there's nothing wrong with that, I think, per se, as long as the people that practice public health treat people who disagree with them politically in a respectful way. But I don't think that that's the sense many people get. Many people get the sense that people in public health disdain their political enemies and act in ways that create, like, why would you listen to someone who looks down on you? That's the sense that I've gotten from watching many other people in public health act toward their political enemies. I think we have to, in public health, have a responsibility to never do that. I mean, I've been playing around with this idea of like, maybe you need a political celibacy vow to enter public health. I don't know if that's possible or not. I mean, everyone has opinions, that maybe that's fine, but you do need some sort of vow that you're going to treat others with respect, even if they disagree with you politically, especially if they disagree with you politically. And I think public health has failed at that. And the result is a catastrophic collapse in the trust of the public in public health, I think, almost everywhere. They can see the disdain. They can see repeated embrace of these ideas that haven't worked out. And actually, the central problem during the pandemic has been embrace of this idea that somehow we have the technology to stop the disease from spreading and make it go away. That's not true. That hasn't been true from the beginning of the pandemic, and is certainly not true now. The best we can do is manage. Is protect vulnerable people while accepting the fact that we now have a fifth circulating coronavirus. And should we restructure all of our society around that, or work on adopting policies that protect people from that as best we can while keeping society going? Public health has told a lie that we can get rid of it. In effect, right? They haven't, many places haven't been explicit about it, but that's the implicit thing that they've said. Just obey us and we'll get rid of it. That central lie has undermined the trust of public health. Certainly undermined my trust in public health.
The undercurrent that seems to be flowing through what you're talking about in terms of the way certain ideas are being suppressed really parallels the general censorship that's going on in other parts of society, doesn't it? And in other words, there really is a whole concept of freedom of expression within science that you talked about when you described why you got into science, because you were fascinated by the natural world and you wanted to discover things. You wanted to share ideas. And it seems to me when people like yourself and Dr. Gupta and Dr. Kulldorff are putting very useful, intriguing new ideas, other ways of looking at things on say YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, and they're getting immediately canceled and taken down. Something very, very frightening is happening within our society. I mean, science is fundamentally important to the way that we see the world and the way that we react to challenges, health challenges, technological challenges, things like, for example, I was just reading a study and I wasn't aware of this, you probably are, talking about how science and technology and agriculture has all but ended world hunger. When you and I were going to high school, it was all about feed the world. Remember Live Aid? And today, since 2000, I saw one stat that over 200,000 people a day have been raised out of poverty. Through the use of technology. If we start suppressing science and the type of scientific discovery in any context, that's very, very dangerous, isn't it, for academia? Because we're going to have fewer brilliant people like you going into academia. And also we're going to have suppression of ideas, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. On world hunger, I don't know if we solved world hunger, but I will say this: that over the last few decades, we have lifted the scientific advances, the green revolution, and techniques of improved agriculture, and have lifted a billion people out of poverty, a billion people, hundreds of millions of people out of dire food insecurity. I mean, it's just it signals success that actually most people weirdly don't know about. I mean, literally, there were a billion fewer people in poverty than there were 20 years ago. Like $2 a day of income around the world, a huge success. The lockdowns reversed it. The lockdowns. We have these economic systems, these global economic systems, where small poor countries, in order to fit into the global economy, reorganize their economic life around what the global economy demands. The lockdowns cut the demand just like that. We snapped our fingers and said we're going to lock down. We don't. I mean, those economies, those poor economies, suffered through a crazy number of people out of work. Many of whom live hand to mouth, right? They buy the stuff that they're going to sell today, sell the stuff with the money they get. They pay for the food they're going to eat, and also the next day's stuff that they're going to sell. We just cut that overnight, and the World Bank estimates that almost 100 million people were thrown into poverty as a result of the 2020 lockdowns, with tens of millions of people in dire food insecurity. With hundreds of thousands of children dead from essentially starvation and from missed vaccinations, childhood vaccinations. I think it was the lockdowns were so short-sighted. It's yes, science for sure. The harm of science to science, and that's going to have very negative long-term consequences. But even in the short run, the lockdowns essentially it's like rich countries just said, okay, we're going to pull up our moat, what are the bridges over the moats, and that's it. Whatever happens out there happens out there. We're going to protect our own. And ironically, we didn't actually even end up protecting our own.
It reminds me of a phrase that you coined called trickle down epidemiology, where really what you were saying is that I think what you were saying, correct me if this is wrong, that really what these non-pharmaceutical interventions did is they just targeted the poor. And so it's a double whammy, because we know from people like you that the poor tend to have the worst health outcomes anyway. And then through the these lockdown measures, it was a double whammy. They get hit worse by the virus, and then even worse by the measures that are supposedly intended to alleviate the spread of the virus. Correct?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. I'll just give you one small data point around this stuff, which a friend of mine did this study in Mumbai in July of 2020, looking for antibody levels in the population of Mumbai in India. It's very, this enormous city in India, with huge inequality, with huge slums, and also very rich, some very rich areas. And what he found was that 70% of the people living in the slums in Mumbai in July of 2020 had antibodies to the COVID, 20% in the other areas. It was the lockdowns in Mumbai were trickle-down epidemiology, right? It protected the laptop class, those who would not lose their jobs as a consequence of the lockdowns, at the expense of others. The slum areas are living 10, 11, 12, 13 people in a house together in these crowded warrants. You're not going to, there's no possibility of lockdown. You're just taking away their ability to work. The results are they get hit by both COVID and also by the harms of the lockdown. Actually, this is not just a developing country thing. It happened in Canada too. If you look in Toronto, the richest neighborhoods of Toronto were well protected. They could stay home, stay safe, keep their jobs. They suffered not at all. The poorest neighbors of Toronto had enormous COVID rates. You see this every place where there's lockdown. This incredible inequality of the lockdown. Who can lock down truly? If you're poor and you need to work to live and you can't replace your job by work from home, I mean, you either go get exposed to the virus, even if you're 65, or your family starves.
Well, the conversation so far has been a little bit dark. What I'd like to do is maybe shift the focus a little bit, and maybe think outside the box, and use our imaginations. And let's say that we're at the end, or to quote Churchill, not the end, but the beginning of the end of COVID. So let's say we're entering the beginning of the post-pandemic period. How are we going to be able to fight this trend that we've talked about of suppression of information, of censorship, and restore liberty not only to the scientific community but to society as a whole? Do you have any ideas about how we can accomplish that? I mean, I know that's a big ask, but I think it's the fundamental. It's one of the fundamental questions I think we have to ask in the West. Is we can maybe understand about how we got here, but how are we going to get the heck out of here? Or how are we going to get back to a place, or better yet, forward to a place where this vital information, intellectual information, science, technology, the arts, where we're going to get back to a society that is more welcoming to a free flow of information? Do you have any ideas about how we can get there or start to get there?
Yeah. So actually, let me just, before I answer that, because I do have some ideas about that, but I should say I don't know we're at the end of the pandemic, because the end of the pandemic is a political decision, not actually an epidemiological one. I think some places are at the end of the pandemic because they've accepted that we're not going to get rid of the virus. They've worked to protect the vulnerable as best we can, given the technologies we have, and have moved on. And even when the cases rise, and they will rise again, they're not going to go back to the measures. They're not going to panic people. Other places, it's not clear to me that they've made that decision. Unfortunately, Leighton, Canada being one of them, you've seen a relaxation of the measures, but the infrastructure that is in place to impose them is still there, and the reasoning that led to them is still, I think, unfortunately, predominant among the folks who rule Canada. So it's still it's still a big fight, I think, going forward for us in some places, to actually convince people that the pandemic is over. It's time to treat this like a disease that's a serious disease still, but treat it like we treat other 200 other infectious diseases that are in common circulation among humans. Okay, but so your bigger question is like, how do we repair science? Right. I mean, Martin Kulldorff, I think in 2020, he tweeted, and I remember seeing this tweet and being struck by it. He tweeted that that the age of enlightenment had ended. The age of enlightenment had ended. What did he mean by that? Well, the age of enlightenment holds this idea of reason and freedom to discuss, freedom to think as key values. It's a prerequisite for science to work. And what we've seen is essentially an undermining of those prerequisites during the pandemic of scientific discussion. You have this certainly politicized science, and it's been done deliberately. And so the question is, like, can we get back? Can we restart the age of enlightenment? I've talked to people, very, very bright people, people like there's a Jonathan Sumption. Lord Sumption is a former Supreme Court justice in the UK who has a very dark view of this. He doesn't believe that it's possible to because the fundamental underlying basis for the Age of Enlightenment is essentially a free space to think within a society, and that on the basis for that is liberal democracies that value it. If on the other hand, I don't know. I guess I don't quite share that dark view. I think it's possible, but we have to decide that we want it, and we have to first take a fundamental look at a hard, honest look at the failures of government policy towards science during the pandemic, because it's actually really government failures that did this. Like, so governments decided that they wanted to suppress scientific heterodoxy. Governments decided to label certain scientists fringe. Governments decided that it was so important that they get compliance that they would silence scientific discussion. That didn't have to happen. And the question is, what processes within the government, what led to that outcome, and how can you reform those processes? How can you put in place guardrails so that it doesn't happen again? And it's going to be complicated, right? So, for instance, take the United States. You have probably the three most important agencies that are involved in the COVID response are the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, the CDC, and the National Institute of Health. Right, so they each play different roles within public health. So the CDC, it's like the main agency that drives the public health response. It's responsible for developing the epidemiological knowledge, designing guidance for communities about how to manage the pandemic and how to deal with the pandemic generally. The NIH is responsible for funding research, vaccines, drugs, all kinds of important other research for understanding the science of the virus and the pandemic. And then the FDA is responsible for evaluating drugs and vaccines and seeing if they're safe enough to use or effective enough to use in the population at large. All three have failed during the pandemic. But you need different reforms for the three, right? So the FDA, I think the major failure has been they're responsible for checking the efficacy and safety of the drugs. I think that they have been effectively captured by pharmaceutical interests. They have what they've done is they've applied a different standard for essentially giving the stamp of approval to drugs and therapies that are developed by pharmaceutical companies. While at the same time, the main thing they're supposed to do is because pharmaceutical companies have a very strong interest in evaluating the drugs, right? It's going to happen no matter what the FDA does. But on the other hand, they're like cheap medications. They've applied a very high standard of evidence, and I'm not sure that some of these cheap medications work, but I can see very clearly the different standard of evidence applied to cheap medications that drug companies don't own versus the standard applied to more expensive medications that are patented and with a strong interest behind them. The FDA is supposed to not do that. It's supposed to have it equal. I've seen the NIH. I mean, the NIH has become, rather than an agency that funds science, produces knowledge, and essentially empowers the scientific community to do its work, it's become a mechanism of control of the scientific community, right? A way to silence the scientific community into compliance. The problem there is you have people like Tony Fauci who play such an important role in the funding of research and in the careers of scientists, success and careers of scientists, also involved in health policy. That's a fundamental conflict of interest. That should not have happened. It's actually, frankly, a conflict of interest I never appreciated existed before the pandemic, but it's clear to me now. And so that's a reform you can do. You can say, look, let's not have, the people that are funding science play no role whatsoever in health policy decision making. All right. The other thing for the CDC, there's an element of politicization that's happened. There's an element of funding of science cherry picked with an aim toward supporting the predetermined conclusions about what to do, rather than funding science or publicizing science just because it's true, even if it contradicts their guidelines. The CDC is failed in so many myriad ways. It really needs a thorough overhaul. That agency is sort of the most difficult to understand how to reform. One idea I've had on this is, you have basically, at least appears to me from the outside, one narrow scientific group of people, group of scientists controlling CDC policy. What you need is a culture within the agency of clash of ideas. Like maybe you have built within it a team B, or you have within it this like culture always bringing in outside scientific voices whenever you're making a difficult decision, independent, not funded by the CDC. I mean, I think some manner of like competition of ideas within the agency, where the culture changes to allow that would go a long way, maybe. But I think these are like, to me, these are preliminary. I think we're going to learn over time what actually went wrong in each of these places, and then that will help us to understand what the right reforms will be.
Well, Doctor, I want to thank you today for your knowledge, for the generosity that you've shown to share it, and also for your optimism, because I think we can agree that's something that is sorely needed in the public. I think it is reassuring to know that people like yourselves who are steeped in the science of COVID and the scientific world are yet have some optimism, have some hope that we can make better decisions and plot better courses in public health and in science generally. Having said that, I'd like to just finish off on a bit of a lighter note. I know that you're on sabbatical from your teaching, but I want you to cast your mind back when you're in front of a classroom full of eager, clear-eyed students. And if you were going to recommend to the people who are listening to this podcast something to read or some other source of information that they could go to perhaps follow up on our discussion and some of the things that you've said, do you have any reading recommendations that you could provide to the people who are consuming this podcast?
I do, although actually my sabbatical ended, unfortunately. So
welcome back. Welcome back, Cotter.
Although I do actually love teaching, so it's not such a bad thing.
I can tell.
So there's a book by Sunetra Gupta from the Oxford epidemiologist, fantastic mathematical epidemiologist, accessible to everybody, that she wrote in 2015 or 2016, I forget exactly. It's called Pandemics, Our Fears and the Facts. It's incredibly prescient. It's a fantastic, accessible work, actually relatively short, to help people understand how someone who has this deep knowledge of how infectious diseases actually work, how best we should address them. And I think readers will be interested in the book because they can compare it with what we actually did and see what the difference is. Sunetra Gupta, Pandemics, Our Fears and the Facts.
I've listened to her speak, and I find that she has the same ability that you do, and that is to take scientific concepts and make them readily understandable for those of us who are not scientists. And personally, I'm grateful for that. I'd like to add my own bit of a reading list. As you can tell, I'm fascinated by Sir Isaac Newton. And so my recommendation is Isaac Newton and Natural Philosophy, which is a book by Niccolo Guicciardini. I hope I haven't butchered that Italian name. There's also a great novel I read some years ago by Philip Kerr called Dark Matter. There are a number of other books called Dark Matter, but this one, the premise of which, it involves a man named Ellis who was imprisoned in the Tower of London for dueling in 1696. He becomes the assistant to Sir Isaac, who was actually the warden of the Royal Mint. And so it's a story of mystery and intrigue that takes some of the best elements of books like The Name of the Rose and The Da Vinci Code. So you get a wonderful story while learning a great deal both about science and the personality of this giant of history who never quite solved the mystery of alchemy, Sir Isaac Newton. But hopefully that's you'll follow up on some of those opportunities, some of those books. There's a lot of great books on science, but those are a couple that I would recommend.
Have you read Neil Stephenson's The Baroque Cycle?
I have not.
So let's
add that one to the list.
Yeah, actually Isaac Newton is one of the major characters in it. The Baroque Cycle, and it's it's Neil Stephenson, so it's filled with like really interesting ideas. He's famously like a science fiction author, but he turned his attention to this era, the launching of the Age of Enlightenment. And it also has the character of Isaac Newton is kind of interesting, and he's irascible is the right.
I am going to read that book. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Bhattacharya. It's been a pleasure Thank you for engaging us in a deep and meaningful conversation. We've gotten to know you a bit better. We've certainly learned a lot about science and also a lot more about public health. And also you've left us with some optimism, which I think is really important.
Real pleasure to talk with you, Leighton. Glad to call you my friend.
Thank you. Likewise.